have pronounced it that way, so I'll just keep on the way I usually do. Abram and Abraham instead of Abraham. Anyway, Terah lived 70 years, begat these 3 boys. Now, the generations of Terah are Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. I mean, he just mentioned it. Probably here is a change of individuals in charge of the genealogy records. Probably the first one he lets go at 26, which would be 26, and then 27, the next one who was in charge took over, probably. Anyway, in addition to Abram, Terah begat 2 more boys, Nahor and Haran, and their names are also mentioned. In fact, when we get up to out of Ur of Chaldees, they go north and some 400 miles, and they will get into what we call the land of Haran. Probably it was named that because of this man, Haran, the boy of Abram. But anyway, those names are found in Genesis 24, Genesis 28, simply because they're associated with cities. I thought it was interesting as I was reading this, Nahor was, let's see, Nahor was also the name of another one, just one generation back. But this is Terah's boy. Nahor was also Terah's father. So Terah named his boy Nahor after his dad, evidently. But while his father was still living, Haran died. So here we have a son dying before the father dies. Haran dies, and evidently it's while he was visiting his daddy, Terah, back down in Ur of the Chaldees. So Haran left one son by the name of Lot, and he became attached. So I'm sure he was invited by his uncle, Abram, to go with him. But he becomes attached to Abram quite a bit, and they're in one another's company a lot. Now, verse 29, Abram and Nahor took wives, and the name of Abram's wife was Sarah, or Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was a daughter of Haran, and Haran was the father of Milcah and the father of a sister, Iscah. Don't have much information on them, so I can't lecture very long on that subject. But notice they're mentioned evidently to contrast with verse 30. Sarah was barren. She had no child. That's the important thing mentioned here. Notice also what's not found. The name of Lot's mother is not given here. And we'll find that Lot's wife, her name's not given. I've always referred to her as Mrs. Lot, but that's because her name is not given for some reason. But the wives of both Abram and Nahor are introduced here at this point, Sarah especially to be focused on in later history. Nahor married Milcah, the daughter of Haran. In other words, he married his niece. So I take that probably Haran was a bit older, but not necessarily. We don't know for sure. But anyway, he married his niece. And Abram also seems to become the guardian of Lot whenever Haran died down in Ur, when he was visiting his dad. So Sarah was a daughter of Terah. That's important. She was a daughter of Terah, but she and Abraham did not have the same mother. So that simply means that Abraham married his half-sister. That's important because of what we have coming up. Some more information on Abraham made a couple of mistakes, maybe a lack of faith, maybe sin. But here, this great man of faith, Abraham, I would say he goofed. But anyway, Terah had more than one wife, so she was just a half-sister of Abraham. And they use that fact when they get into a foreign country. We'll see just in a little bit. I've made this statement before, I'll make it again. We're still early on when it comes to man marrying within the family. Still very early. That simply means that this was not particularly dangerous to marry relatives this close as it would be after that. Afterwards, some 500 years later, God gives instructions through Moses that this is not to occur. But this is early. They're still trying to multiply and fill the earth. And so they could marry nieces, cousins, etc. But they would end up being forbidden by Moses. Well, God gives the instructions through Moses. But notice that Abraham, unlike Haran and Nahor, he had no children down there in Ur of the Chaldees or in Mesopotamia. She was barren. And it had nothing to do with age. She had always been barren, not able to have children. Okay, now, finally, they get up to Haran, to the area 400 miles north of Ur of the Chaldees. And notice that they settled in Haran, and that's when Terah died. He was 205 years old. That's still quite lengthy, 205. But I've heard of some people just within the last couple of weeks. A man was 115. That's getting on up there for our day and age. In fact, that's getting on up there compared to Moses' day and age when he wrote what he did when David wrote what he did in Psalms chapter 90. But anyway, they left Ur of the Chaldees. Terah took Abraham or Abram and Sarah with him, as well as his grandson Lot. And when they get to Haran, something happened. I'd like to know a lot more about what happened. But Terah does not go with Abraham on over west to the land of Canaan, the promised land. He didn't go he stayed in Haran for some reason. Probably it became apparent to Abram that his daddy, Terah, was not going to go with him. So he goes ahead and gets Lot, and they start this trek on over toward where they're supposed to be going in the first place. Now keep this in mind too, very important. Eventually, Terah began to be involved with idolatry. We'll see this when we get to the book of Joshua, chapter 24. And we're not going to be doing that while I'm teaching necessarily, but I want to point this out because it will come up here in just a little bit, that Terah gets to be an idol worshiper. Even after God had called Abram, his son, and possibly made the same call to Terah. I say that because Terah and Abraham went up there together. Maybe they got the same call. But one writer says what Terah, what he might have been, is what his son became. What Terah could have been, Abraham became. That is a blessing to all families of the earth. Okay, now chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12. You've heard this many times. The Lord had said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country, from your relatives, from your father's house, unto the land that I'm going to show you, and I will make of you a great nation. Now, mark that. That's taking a different route. God, at this point, begins to talk about the blessing coming on all mankind is going to be through a nation. Okay, now, not only that, but get out and I'll show you a land. I'm going to make you a great nation. I will bless you. I'll make your name great. Thou shalt be a blessing. I will bless them that bless you and curse them that curse you. And in you, in thee, shall all nations of the earth be blessed. Due to the use of that word all right there, I think with good reason that this is a promise that's sort of an echoing of the Genesis 3:15. Christ would be coming some almost 2,000 years in the future from the time of Abraham. 2,000 years pass. 2,000 years have already passed when you get to Abraham. 2,000 plus. Okay, now, most of the people continued in their rebellious ways, worshiping what they wanted to worship, like down there in Ur of the Chaldees. I'm talking about already compared to Noah's day. They started out, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, 3 boys. They were responsible for the filling of the earth, replenishing the earth. And it didn't take long for sin to set back in. They became rotten. They became worshipers of idol, God, as we see in Joshua. Now notice, there were a few that retained some knowledge of the true God. Few. For example, you're going to hear the name Melchizedek. Where'd that guy come from? He was not in the line. He just sort of pops up. But he was recognized as a worshiper of the true God that you and I worship. That's exactly what Abraham recognized too when he met Melchizedek. But in addition to him, there were others, like probably, Well, let's see. Who was the man that, besides Melchizedek? Oh, the patient one, Job. Job lived just about the time of Abraham. So there were others who did stick with God and worship him as God commanded, but there were very few. Okay, that's one reason why God, I guess, decided to go with the family of Abraham and make a great nation out of them, because it was through that nation, the Jewish nation, that the Christ was going to be born some 2,000 years later. Okay, now, also, it's been around, as I said, 2,000 years since creation. So that's about the middle point. Abraham is about the middle point between creation and Jesus Christ. I say about. God had a new approach then. He's going to make a new nation here. And his revelation to other people is going to be not through the Father so much anymore, but through the promise of the new nation. Moses is going to be the lawgiver. Okay, now, while he was in Haran, God renewed this call from Abraham that he had made early to get out of Ur the Chaldees. He renewed that. And he was to go on to the land of Canaan and establish this new nation. And of course, as I said, Joshua 24, you're going to see that Terah had already begun to worship other gods while still down there in Ur. The time right now is about 1921, 1,921 years BC, before Christ. So in round numbers, 2,000 years, both directions. He called this fellow Abram to go into a strange land. And it was a land that had already been settled by the descendants of Canaan. Remember Canaan? We call these people the Canaanites. But that's because they came from a man by the name of Canaan, who was Ham's boy, H-A-M. Noah was the granddaddy, the son was Ham, and Canaanites came through him. This took many, many years, obviously. But now God makes it clear, if you stop and think about it, God's making it clear in chapter 12 that the Savior was going to be born into a human family. And who that is simply means that everybody else is going to be excluded, except those that were in the genealogical line that we find in Luke 3 and Matthew 12. So it becomes clear to Abraham at this point that it's going to be accomplished. God's promise is going to bless all nations one day, and it's going to be through my family, Abraham realizes. Genesis 12, verse 4. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, obeying the Lord, and Lot went along with them. Abram was 75 years old when he left out of Haran. Not when he left out of Ur, but when he left out of Haran. If he was going to go to the land of Canaan directly when he was in Ur the Chaldees, he could have gone mostly west but instead he ventured north some 400 miles and then back down southwest to where God was going to send him in the first place. Anyway, 75 years old. And notice that the aging process was much slower even at this late date. Earlier, I mean, they lived 400, 500, 600, 900 years. But that aging process has gotten a lot shorter, but still, the aging process was slower than it is today. And why is that important? Well, I bring it up because Sarah, or Sarai, that Sarah was considered to be a very beautiful woman. And some of that probably had to do with a youthful look, Y-O-U-T-H-F-U-L. She aged well. Now, Abraham's nephew, Lot, decided to accompany them because his own dad, Haran, had died back before Terah died. So his grandson and granddaddy were living together. Haran had already died. And it was a long journey back to Canaan. Canaan was about 400 miles south and west of Haran, where they had come to. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8 makes this statement. By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go out to a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, Abraham obeyed. And he went out not knowing where he went. I think probably Abraham knew in general where he was going, but he didn't know specifically. And of course, after they left Haran, he didn't even have Terah, his own dad, go with him. He decided he's going to stay right there in Haran. So on the way to Canaan, Lot and Abraham stopped for a time at, it's called Shechem. Let's see, verse 6. Abraham passed through the land unto a place called Shechem. You remember I talked last week, maybe week before last, about this letter S in Greek. It's called Sin and Sheen. Well, you can call it Shechem, but you could also call it Shechem, S-H-E-C-H-E-M, Shechem. We know it better by the latter term, Shechem. But he stopped there and built an altar to make a sacrifice to the Lord. And this is the first time in Scripture we read of an actual appearance of God to an individual. Earlier you could find statements like this, that God walked with Adam, and with Enoch, he walked with God and was not, because God took him. But now you have the word actually used here, that God appeared to him, which is a little different from what we're used to. That's, to me, interesting. Maybe he appeared in some visible sort of fashion. The Bible doesn't go on and tell us. So Abraham began traveling, and he stopped for a time at a mountain near Bethel. I've also mentioned before, we hear the name Bethel, or Bethel Acres here. The word Beth means house, H-O-U-S-E, B-E-T-H, means house, and El means of God, Elohim, a plurality of gods. God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, Elohim. But El simply means God. So Bethel is house of God. At least that's what it meant back when it was first came into being. Abraham continued traveling though, and this was about 35 miles on down. He stopped at this place called Shechem. At this particular time, Abraham was more or less a nomad. He just, he traveled from one place to another constantly. He had a lot of herd, well, let's say a sheep. He was a shepherd. They had a lot of sheep, and he was always trying to find more pasture for sheep. So he would move around wherever there was place for water and pasture. And also he would move where there weren't too many people. That is, to me, another interesting facet of this whole thing. But he wanted to go where he had some freedom, didn't have to worry about people encroaching upon his land that he was feeding his sheep out of. Now verse 10 says, and there was a famine. Now we got bad news. There was a famine in the land. Where? In the land of Canaan, the land that a few hundred years later is going to be called the land of milk and honey. It's going to be well watered. It's going to be great land. Even in the days of Lot, just a few years later, it was a great place. But right now, Abraham went to Egypt. So he's going south down to Egypt, where the Mediterranean Sea stops and curves and goes on to the northern part of Egypt even today. But there's a famine here. Question, does that sound familiar? God's people leaving, well, you know the story. It happens a lot later with Joseph and Jacob. They go down to Egypt because there's a famine in the land of Canaan. But this happened years earlier, hundreds of years earlier with Abraham. Chapter 13, verse 1. So evidently the land wasn't able to support him, so he decides to go into the land of Egypt because he had heard there was a lot of prosperity going on down there. Yes?
It was probably during the time when Abram and Sarai were sojourning in Egypt. It was probably about the time when they left, when Abram and Sarai, when Hagar joined their household.
Yeah, that's going to be happening here in shortly. We'll pick that up. Hagar. To me, Hagar is an interesting name because I have a great aunt and a whole host of relatives. That was their last name, Hager, Hagar. Okay, now back to the text, Genesis 12. They get down there in verse 11, and as they came near Egypt, Abraham is thinking to himself, I'm going to be in trouble. They're going to notice that I have a beautiful wife, and they're going to kill me so they can have the wife for themselves. So he says to Sarah, behold now, I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. You're a beautiful lady. Therefore, here's what's going to happen. When the Egyptians see you, they're going to say, this is his wife. And then they'll kill me so they can have you and save you alive. I'll be dead, you'll be alive. Now look, this would never have happened if they followed God's instructions to start with. They were told to go to Canaan. They did, but Abraham decided that he'd leave because of famine. So he goes down there to Egypt, and he gets in trouble almost immediately. So here's what he says. Wife, I want you to say to other people that you are my sister, because then it will be well with me because of you, and my soul will live because of you. Verse 14 says, and it came to pass that when they came into Egypt, the Egyptians, plural, the men down there, beheld the woman that she was very fair. She was a nice-looking lady. And so Abraham, what he was afraid of, was beginning to take place. The princes also of Pharaoh saw her, commended her, instead of taking her for one other than taking her for his wife, they commended her to Pharaoh. Pharaoh, we have a beautiful woman here, sure would look nice in your harem. In essence, that's what they're saying. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Now, Abraham surely thought one step ahead of what might happen. I don't know if he did or not, but when he made that statement to his wife, you tell him you're my sister, he thought, that saved my life. Yeah, it may, but it may get you into trouble too. Lying usually does. And so, verse 16 says that Pharaoh treated Abraham very well. I'm going to go ahead and use the word Abraham for Abram because it is the same person. His name was changed by God just a little bit later. But he treated Abraham very well, and he had sheep and oxen and he-asses and men servants and maid servants and she-asses and camels. In other words, he was well off. He also received a lot of that stuff from Pharaoh when he leaves, just a little bit. But you know, today, I've noticed in my life how that when people make decisions, and then they look back upon it and they realize, I'm quite prosperous now, which proves to me that God was back of what happened. When I made that decision, that was God's decision, really. Because, why? Look how well off I am now. That's the way a lot of people reason. That's a misinterpreting prosperity. And that kind of that comes up every time that you want to compromise, not do what God said, but compromise with mankind. You better watch out. Now, God finally has to deal with that issue. And he did, and he settled it. And he forced Abraham and Lot and so on to get out of this uncompromising position back to a walking after true faith. But this was one incident that Abraham got himself into. Now, he was suddenly, due to that decision that he made, he's suddenly going to realize, that decision that I made has some issues involved with it. Things for which he was not prepared. That often happens, of course, when a believer will fall into a group of ungodly people and begin to say, well, what they're doing is not all that bad, and before long he's doing the same thing. That's compromising. But keep that in mind. If Abraham had acknowledged that Sarah was his wife, he would be killed and taken by the Egyptians into who knows what sort of more immorality and sexual degradation. So he decided that he'd come up with this way of getting around that. That would be his solution. Just tell them you are my sister. Now remember, this is still early centuries after the flood. So close marriages were still rather common and in some cases necessary. If Sarah was recognized as his sister, though, I mean, how far are you thinking ahead? Do you just play checkers or do you play chess? It's quite a difference between checkers and chess. Chess means that involves thinking ahead, 2 or 3 moves ahead. Well, Abraham wasn't thinking ahead when he made that decision, but the point is that she and Abraham would be treated with more respect and his life would not be in danger, so that he thought that'd be a good idea. I'm guessing that she went along with it because it looks like that's what she said. She let everybody know that she was Abraham's sister. Now, she was seen by the princes, the leaders of the country under Pharaoh, and they said this would be a prime candidate to add to your harem. So they thought they were doing him a favor, letting him know. But his compromise didn't serve well for Abraham. What could happen if Pharaoh actually decided to take Abraham as his wife? Did that ever occur to Abraham? What might happen? I used to tell my children, look at the big picture, not just right now, but the big picture. Abraham, look at the big picture. What might happen? Would both Abraham and Sarah continue to be involved in this deception after Pharaoh takes Sarah, his wife, as his wife now? How long is he going to put up with that? I mean, these are questions that you'd think that he would give some thought to. It had been God's intention, as we read in the first part of chapter 12, it was God's intention that the promised seed of the world being blessed through Christ, that seed is going to be through you and Sarah. That was God's original intention. And so, if that were the case, then this development, if it had come to pass, this development would certainly have been prevented from happening. If he had taken her for his wife, there goes the promise that's made to Abraham, through your seed, all nations are going to be blessed. So think ahead, Abraham, what might happen? Well, of course, things did turn out okay, and you could read about that in the next few verses. But the question would come up, and it really did. The question of Sarah and Pharaoh. So he wanted to know, why'd you tell me that this woman was your sister when she's your wife? Well, this is God's way. He brought this whole issue up, but let's see, we're in verse 12:18. Pharaoh called Abraham, "What is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife?" Verse 19, "Why did you say she is my sister? I might have taken her to wife. Now therefore, behold thy wife, take her and go. Get out of here. And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away and his wife and all that he had. And he was fortunate enough that Pharaoh gave him a lot of, nice going away present. But this was very close to being an interruption to God's plan for sending Christ as the Messiah. He made that promise to Abraham, and what Abraham thought would be a blessing, go down to Egypt where there's a lot of water and prosperity, that wasn't the thing that he should have done. Okay, it's easy for us to be critical about Abraham, but what would we have done if we were in the same situation? Maybe we'd try to come up with something else, some other plan. But here you have Abraham being rebuked for his actions, and he's rebuked by a bunch of unbelievers. That's ironical. A bunch of unbelievers rebuking Abraham, who's supposed to be following God. Why did you tell me she was your wife? Okay, Genesis chapter 13. Abraham went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, which was now, he had a lot. I'm talking not about Lot the man, but a lot of physical blessings. And he went up into the south. Incidentally, people, if you're going south, are you going up or are you going down? We say up north, down south, back east, and out west. But if you were where Abraham was, he went up out of Egypt. He went north, he and his wife, and they went into the south. Well, the south is another name for the Negev, N-E-G-E-V. You've probably heard of Negev, but that's a whole land just called into the south. I think that's where, I believe, wasn't that where later on Solomon and the Queen of Sheba came up from the south? Anyway, it rings a bell when I say the south. I think she was the queen of the south and came up to see Solomon and all of his wealth and said the half has not yet been told. So she was very impressed with what Solomon had. That's still 2,000 more years in the future. Next week, chapter 13.